One of the ways Donald Trump won the 2016 election was through the complete embrace of him by evangelicals, both the base and pastors and leaders in that movement. One of the most prominent is a pastor named Robert Morris. He founded a Texas megachurch in Southlake, Texas. Morris was also a spiritual advisor to Trump while he was in the White House. Here he is in the Rose Garden in 2020, just a few rows behind where then Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett's family and the First Lady are about to sit. And here is Trump visiting Morris's church earlier that summer, giving his personal assessment of the man.
So I want to thank Pastors Robert Morris and Steve Dullen. They're great people. Great people with a great reputation, I have to say that. Great reputation. And Gateway Church, the team has been incredible in hosting us. And I'd now like to ask Pastor Morris and Bishop Jackson to lead us in prayer.
Well, Robert Morris just resigned from his church following allegations that he sexually abused a child. In a statement to an evangelical news site, Morris said he was involved in an inappropriate sexual behavior with a young lady. Those are his words. He didn't mention that the young lady in question was a 12-year-old girl. In his statement, Trump's one-time spiritual advisor admitted he continued to molest the child on, quote, several occasions over the next few years. Mike Hixenbaugh is a senior investigative reporter for NBC News who's been all over this story. He writes about Pastor Morris in his book, They Came for the Schools, One Town's Fight Over Race and Identity and the New War for America's Classrooms, and he joins me now. Mike, this is something that happened a long time ago that we are learning about now. Take us through how this came out.
Well, last week, the survivor in this case, Cindy Clemishire, who has tried telling the story in different ways for years, came forward in a blog post and spelled out in very clear detail how when she was 12 years old on Christmas in 1982, Pastor Morris, who was a family friend then, a young traveling evangelist, invited her into his room, where he was the guest room at her house, and proceeded to molest her, the first of several instances where he would do that over the next 4.5 years. And as you mentioned in the lead-in, Pastor Morris and Gateway Church responded initially by saying, this is an old sin. Pastor Morris has addressed this moral failure of this relationship with a young lady. And, he's repented, and this has been taken care of. Flash forward a few days, there was a lot of pressure around this when people started pointing out, yeah, the young lady was 12. That's a child. And yesterday he resigned from the church that he founded 20-plus years ago.
Now, he had been telling a sort of story about a kind of redemption arc, about stepping away from the ministry in the 1980s. Because he had been confronted by the then girl's father at that time. Is that right?
That's right. And I've been talking with, former Gateway members and former pastors at the church. They talk about how he talked about this story all the time. And it became kind of like a signature part of his biography, that he had this moral failing when he was young. And it was around sexual immorality with, again, a young lady. In some tellings, he would describe himself almost as a victim, saying that the young lady had a Jezebel spirit and had tempted him, and in fact, that she was the one that made it continue. He tried to stop it, and she made it continue. So he tells these stories as a way of saying, you should be open about your sin and come forward. But in reality, we now know he was covering and papering over the reality of child sexual abuse, which is, a crime.
He also has been quite a prominent member of the evangelical movement, politically influential. I mean, this is not just there are obviously many evangelical pastors, thousands, probably tens of thousands in this country. This is a particularly connected and powerful individual.
Absolutely. Yes. Trump's spiritual advisor. He's really leaned into the idea of, advocating for a restoration of Christian morality in America through Republican politics. And so you see that with him inviting Glenn Beck to speak from the pulpit at his church and being aligned with Donald Trump. I write about extensively in the book. He's also gotten very engaged over the last few years with kind of warning about the dangers children face in schools. And this, I want to emphasize this, the survivor here in this case, Cindy, doesn't want this story to become just about politics. She's very primarily concerned with Robert Morris not being in leadership and kind of attacking the culture that allows this to permeate. But at the same time, lots of other people have watched as people like Robert Morris have warned that teachers and school librarians are a danger to children because, and have used the language that they're grooming children because they have books on their shelves. Morris has preached about that from the pulpit and endorsed specific school board candidates who would fight against, this Satan's work in school libraries. People who saw that play out are really frustrated and outraged now, knowing, he's pointing at school librarians. Some of these books that were being targeted actually are literature that describe grooming as a way of helping kids understand what warning signs to watch out for. And so to have him be standing in the pulpit warning about this, given his history, has been, a lot really difficult for people to process. And there's a lot of anger, both among survivors and educators who've been targeted by this rhetoric.
Yeah, I would note in 2017, as you reported, he called on parishioners to support a bill pitched by Texas Governor Greg Abbott, a Republican, as a way to, quote, protect the safety of women and children that would have banned transgender people from using public bathrooms that correspond with their genders. Important to protect children from sexual abuse. On that, I agree. Mike Hixenbaugh, thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris.
Mike's excellent new book, They Came for the Schools, One Town's Fight Over Race and Identity and the New War for Americans Classrooms, is out now. I suggest you check it out. Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. It is that time of year when Donald Trump's right-wing Supreme Court waits until the very end of the term to bludgeon us with their decisions. There are 21 opinions remaining, but we are all holding our breath for one in particular that has a kind of clock ticking. Of course, that is Trump v. United States. The former president's claim that he is immune from being criminally prosecuted for anything he did while he was in the White House. Now, all of the justices are, adult, grown human beings who can read the newspaper and know that time is of the essence in this case. We are less than 5 months away from the election when Donald Trump will have, if you look at polls now, basically a 50-50 shot at taking back the Oval Office. But at every turn, this court, the conservative majority of this court, one has to imagine, has dragged its feet. The federal case against Donald Trump for his attempt to overturn the 2020 election charges him with 4 felony counts, including conspiracy to defraud the United States. It has been on hold for more than 6 months. The judge in that case, Federal District Judge Tanya Chutkan, was forced to pause the case all the way back on December 13th of last year amid Trump's immunity appeal. That was 189 days ago. The Supreme Court finally agreed to take up the case on February 28th. They heard arguments at the end of April, and we are still waiting. 112 days have passed with nothing. No decision from the Supreme Court, no movement towards a trial that could hold Donald Trump accountable for his attempted insurrection and also demonstrate to voters whether the man is guilty or not guilty of the grave crimes with which he is charged. Now, to be clear, as we've often said on this show, the wheels of justice do move slowly, but this is not normal. As law professor Leah Lippman puts it in an opinion piece in the New York Times today, something's rotten about the justices taking so long on Trump's immunity case. She goes on to explain, quote, Mr. Trump's lawyers put together a set of arguments that are so outlandish they shouldn't take much time to dispatch. The Wall Street Journal also notes that this term as a whole, the whole Supreme Court term, is moving at a historically slow pace. Quote, according to Adam Feldman, creator of the Empirical SCOTUS blog, the justices are completing decisions at the second slowest rate since the 1946 term. Now, keep in mind, each justice has a team of 4 very bright and industrious law clerks assisting them, and they only work 9 months out of the year. It's also really worth remembering the last time the Supreme Court heard a case this pressing, the direct analog. It involved a corrupt Republican president. It was in 1974. It had United States in the title, United States versus Nixon. And that, of course, was when then sitting President Nixon claimed he was immune from complying with the subpoena in the Watergate investigation because of executive privilege. In that case, the Supreme Court managed to move much more expeditiously.
Good evening. The U.S. Supreme Court, acting as swiftly as it ever has, today announced it will review the special Watergate prosecutor's complaint against President Nixon. It was just 1 week ago today when Leon Jaworski asked the court to rule on the president's defiance of a subpoena for more White House tapes. It was yesterday when the president's lawyer asked the court not to rush to judgment and allow the case to be heard in the Court of Appeals. But this afternoon, the court said it would hear oral arguments in about 5 weeks, which set the stage for a possible confrontation between the president and the high court on the issue of executive privilege.
At 3:30, the weekly conference ended. 10 minutes later, the Chief Justice issued a single sheet of paper, setting in motion the biggest constitutional test of presidential power since the Civil War. In the case, now entitled United States of America versus Richard Nixon, President, the court agreed to settle the question whether the president can be compelled to furnish evidence to the Watergate special prosecutor. Bypassing the Court of Appeals, the court said briefs should be submitted June 21st and replies July 1st. The historic argument was set for July 8th.
Good evening. The Supreme Court of the United States today heard 3 hours of arguments that could very well determine President Nixon's chances of staying in office for a full term. There were two principal questions before the court: whether Mr. Nixon can be forced to give up an additional 64 White House tapes to the special prosecutor, and whether the federal grand jury was within its jurisdiction when it named the president an unindicted co-conspirator. The thrust of the argument centered on the release of the additional tapes.
A decision is expected in a week or two. Even before this morning's argument, one justice was writing and circulating his ideas. Another had his clerk prepare a draft opinion.
Good evening. President Nixon has not yet responded to the sledgehammer decision of the Supreme Court today, which ruled that he must immediately turn over tapes of 64 presidential conversations. In a unanimous decision written by Chief Justice Warren Burger, the court rejected 8-0 Mr. Nixon's claim of absolute privilege on those tapes.
The court said the president's claim of absolute privilege would upset the constitutional balance of a workable government. It said its ruling was only that the president had to give way in criminal proceedings, a very limited intrusion since presidents would rarely be involved in criminal cases.
So 5 decades ago, the court took less than 2 months to decide President Nixon's case. They agreed to hear the case on May 31st, 1974. You see it there. They gave each set of lawyers 3 weeks to file their briefs, then 10 days after that to reply. The court heard oral arguments on July 8th, and just 16 days later, just over 2 weeks, they issued their unanimous opinion rejecting President Nixon's claim of executive privilege. In total, from start to finish, all done in 54 days. Just 54 days to decide Richard Nixon's case, and we are still waiting for the outcome of Donald Trump's after 112 days and counting. These are similar cases with similar urgency. President Nixon was making a completely ahistorical, unconstitutional claim of immunity because he did not want to turn over his tapes in the Watergate investigation. The court ruled no, the president is not a king and does not get to ignore the laws. Donald Trump is once again arguing the president is a kind of king, that he can do anything and everything, including ordering the assassination of his political rivals and not face prosecution unless impeached and convicted. And yet, the court drags its feet. Members of that court, all of them knowing full well, every day they delay makes it less and less possible that Trump will stand trial for the insurrection before this next election. Leah Littman's the author of that New York Times op-ed. She's a professor at the University of Michigan Law School and co-host of the Strict Scrutiny podcast, along with Melissa Murray and my wife, Kate Shaw, and she joins me now. It's great to see you, Leah. I love this piece, partly because you just walked through the timeline, which inspired us to do so as well. Why do you not think there's a good faith explanation here that it's complex or that this court is moving slowly because there's some weird factional battles happening behind the scenes?
I think this court has lost the benefit of the doubt and the presumption of good faith for any number of reasons. One is that they are more than capable of acting quickly, even in difficult cases where there is disagreement. The Trump disqualification case arising out of Colorado, where the Colorado State Court took him off the ballot, that resulted in a divided opinion, and yet the court still was able to get it out before Super Tuesday, before people went to cast their ballots, and within a month of the oral argument. Here, there might well be division, and yet the court has taken 2 months since oral argument. And the arguments in the case, I think, are way more outlandish than any of the arguments on behalf of disqualifying a president who participated in the January 6th insurrection. You add to that all of the indications of the justice's, let's say, extracurricular activities, like Justice Alito flying multiple Stop the Steal flags associated at his house. And all of that, I think, is more than enough indication that this court just cannot be trusted to actually follow the rules and adhere to the legal process when it comes to cases involving Donald Trump.
That point about the Colorado case is great. I had totally forgotten that time frame, right? So in there, the clock that's ticking is they got to print the ballots, I think, for Colorado. They were going to actually vote. They were going to send them out to mail them. And of course, the notion was if we don't act, he's not going to be on the ballot, right? So the sort of constraining thing they had to do was like, if we don't act quickly, Donald Trump won't be on the ballot. In this, it's totally flipped. If we don't act, then nothing happens to our guy. And they seem to be taking longer.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think if you go back to the oral argument in the Trump immunity case, you saw the Republican justices attempt to interject basically every other possibility into this case, aside from the case they were actually being asked to decide. So Justice Alito, for example, floated the possibility to the special counsel's office, well, what if a president just made a mistake? Could he be prosecuted then? As if the Stop the Steal movement was just some kind of oopsie that the president had engaged in or the former president had engaged in for the last 2 months. I mean, this case doesn't involve a simple mistake. And if you look back to the Nixon case, there, the Supreme Court basically said, we don't have to resolve absolutely everything related to immunity. All we have to say is presidents aren't immune from criminal process based on some generalized definition of confidentiality.
There are 6 days to go until Election Day in New York, and we already have the most expensive congressional primary in American history. It's happening in the 16th district, where Representative Jamal Bowman faces a challenge from a fellow Democrat, Westchester County Executive George Latimer. More than $22 million have been poured into this race. Again, there's a primary between 2 Democrats in a D+20 district. Why all that spending? Where is it coming from? Well, this race isn't really about the candidates, at least the spending part of it. It's more about the shape of politics in the post-Citizens United era. Just take a look at this bar chart here. Here are the 5 top spenders in New York 16, according to the data firm AdImpact. Both the candidates are there, as well as some groups you would expect in a liberal Democratic primary. The vast majority of all the ad spending in this primary, $14 million, is coming from over there on the left from a single super PAC called the United Democracy Project, or UDP. They are the sole reason this is the most expensive primary ever in American history. Now, UDP is a super PAC created and largely funded by the pro-Israel lobby group AIPAC. And it's not surprising that AIPAC and its associated groups are going after Democrats like Bowman specifically. Ever since he gained his seat by knocking off longtime incumbent Eliot Engel back in 2020, Bowman has been aligned with the progressive squad in the House, and he has been criticizing the Israeli government, calling for a ceasefire in its war with Gaza. His opponent, George Latimer, basically takes the opposite positions. He supports Israel's continued war and opposes a ceasefire. And you might think, okay, yeah, fair enough. That is a very divisive issue among the Democratic electorate in a primary. That's what primaries are for, right? But here's the thing. UDP, the pro-Israel super PAC, didn't drop $14 million of pro-Israel ads on this race. In fact, it didn't mention Israel in its ads at all.
Jamal Bowman has his own agenda and refuses to compromise, even with President Biden.
George Latimer is putting people ahead of personal agendas and delivering real progressive results.
Apparently, the choice not to mention Israel in any ads was a strategic one on the part of the pro-Israel super PAC funding those ads. A UDP spokesman telling Politico last month, "We run ads on the issues voters are most focused on," which, again, is a little odd because, it is sort of a big issue, you imagine. But it seems almost as if the pro-Israel group thinks that pro-Israel ads might not actually play as well as they would hope in a heavily Democratic district like Bowman's. So instead, the group that can make unlimited expenditures is using its money to attack Bowman, as you saw in that ad, for being insufficiently loyal to President Biden and his agenda. That does play in a heavily Democratic district. The irony, as Slate revealed last spring, is that most of UDP's top funders are Republican mega donors, including Bernie Marcus, the former CEO of Home Depot, Robert Kraft, the New England Patriots owner, and Paul Singer, who also famously took Sam Alito on that luxury fishing trip. But it gets even weirder, okay? If you look back at that bar chart, there's another super PAC there. That's Fair Shake. See that there next to George Latimer, in between Jamal Bowman. Now, Fair Shake is a super PAC backed by cryptocurrency interests who want to keep crypto lightly regulated. They are running ads against Bowman, too. But they are not running ads on crypto. They are running ads on, wait for it, Israel. This is what Citizens United has wrought. Enormous swarms of big money from anodyne-sounding groups pounding a candidate while concealing what their own interests are. It's a bizarre perversion of genuine democratic discourse that does not serve voters. But it works great for mega donors.